Workplaces are meant to be safe zones of productivity, yet history has witnessed shocking tragedies where ordinary jobs turned into scenes of horror. From freak accidents to catastrophic disasters, some workplace deaths have left a chilling mark on memory, reminding us how fragile safety can be when overlooked. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster is one of those grim industrial stories that feels ripped from a dystopian novel, except it was horribly real and played out in the early 1930s in the small town of Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, when a project that was supposed to bring progress ended up writing one of the darkest chapters in American labor history. It all started with Union Carbide deciding to bore a tunnel through Gauley Mountain to divert the New River for hydroelectric power. A seemingly impressive feat of engineering that turned into a death trap for hundreds of workers. The job itself did not sound too insane at first, as the plan was to dig a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock. But the rock was practically pure silica. And when you drill through silica without water or ventilation, you are not just making a tunnel, you are basically creating giant invisible death clouds. Those clouds filled the lungs of the mostly poor men hired for the job, many of whom were African American migrants looking for work during the Great Depression. Instead of being given masks or any kind of protection, they were shoved into the dust storm with shovels, drills, and desperation, and within weeks people were coughing, wheezing, and suffocating from the inside as silicosis, an incurable lung disease, shredded their bodies. What makes this even worse is that the company knew silica dust was dangerous. The science was not some futuristic mystery, but keeping production fast and cheap mattered more than keeping workers alive. The deaths piled up quickly, yet officials tried to brush it under the rug. Some estimates say around 476 deaths were officially recorded. But survivors, families, and historians agree the real number was probably closer to 700, maybe even over 1,000, making it not just a workplace accident, but arguably the worst industrial disaster in United States history caused by occupational disease. The way it was handled only adds to the tragedy, because many of the dead black workers were buried in unmarked mass graves, their stories erased while Union Carbide cashed in on the project and the local community lived with the haunting legacy. The disaster sparked outrage among labor advocates and eventually forced the conversation about occupational safety into the public eye, leading to serious recognition of silicosis as an industrial disease. But at the time, the victims and their families were left with little more than grief, poverty, and scars of neglect. Even today, if you visit the area, the story is not front and center like you would expect for such a massive loss of life. It is remembered in patches, in poems like Muriel Rukeyser's Book of the Dead, in local whispers, in a scattering of memorials. But the echoes of those men gasping in dusty darkness still feel heavy because the disaster was not some freak accident of fate, it was preventable. It stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when human lives are treated as expendable in the name of progress. While the Hawk's Nest Tunnel looks like just another piece of Appalachian engineering, its true legacy is a cautionary tale carved into the lungs of the men who built it and buried beneath the silence of unmarked graves. It is a story that deserves to be remembered not only for its tragedy, but also as a warning about the cost of greed and negligence when safety is ignored. On the morning of March 20th, 1905, the city of Brockton, Massachusetts, was alive with the steady rhythm of industry. At the Grover Shoe Factory, one of the area's most important employers, workers filed in as usual, expecting another long day of stitching leather, gluing soles, and keeping production lines moving. The 5-story brick building stood proudly as a symbol of progress and opportunity, housing nearly 400 men and women who relied on it to provide for their families. But in the basement, hidden from sight, a much older and more dangerous presence lurked. The factory's steam boiler, a piece of equipment that powered much of the operation, had been running past its prime, and while it had been patched and checked, it was ultimately a ticking time bomb waiting to ignite disaster. Just before 8 a.m., the unimaginable happened. With a deafening roar, the boiler exploded with such force that it tore through the basement and shot upward, ripping apart the floors above it like paper. The initial blast was so violent that it destroyed the main support columns, causing massive sections of the building to collapse instantly. Those on the lower floors were caught completely off guard, buried beneath falling beams and heavy machinery. The explosion also ignited fires that quickly spread, fueled by shoe materials like leather, fabric, and adhesives, all highly flammable. In moments, what had been a bustling factory was transformed into a nightmare of smoke, flames, and twisted wreckage. Workers screamed for help as the fire consumed the building, and those who managed to survive the initial collapse scrambled desperately for exits that were either blocked or already engulfed in flames. Rescue efforts began immediately, but they were harrowing and dangerous. Firefighters, police, and townspeople rushed to the scene, pulling survivors from the wreckage and braving the inferno to save those still trapped inside. Yet for many, it was too late. The heat was so intense that rescuers could not reach parts of the factory until hours later, by which time the devastation was complete. By the end of the day, 58 people had lost their lives, and more than 150 others were injured, making it one of the deadliest industrial accidents in Massachusetts history. Entire families were shattered, as the victims were not just workers, but fathers, brothers, sisters, and sons, whose livelihoods had been tied to the Grover shoe factory. The city of Brockton was plunged into mourning, its tight-knit community shaken to its core. Churches held memorials, streets filled with grieving relatives, and the disaster became the defining tragedy of the town's history. Even those who had not lost loved ones could not escape the weight of sorrow, as the smoke rising from the destroyed building lingered as a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The disaster did not simply fade into memory. In the aftermath, investigators examined the wreckage and found clear evidence that the boiler had been poorly maintained and was no longer safe for operation. Public outrage grew, and the tragedy became a powerful call for reform. Massachusetts soon passed stricter regulations on boiler inspections, setting new standards that would eventually spread across the United States. The Grover Shoe Factory disaster became a grim reminder of the dangers of neglecting industrial safety, especially in an era when factories were rapidly expanding and workers often faced hazardous conditions. For the people of Brockton, it was more than just a news headline. It was a collective scar, a moment when progress had come at a terrible cost. Today, the disaster stands as both a cautionary tale and a turning point, reminding us that safety must never be taken for granted in the pursuit of industry. The story of the Monongah mining disaster of 1907 is like something out of a dark industrial-era nightmare, the kind of tragedy that makes you stop and wonder how people ever signed up for this job in the first place. Picture a small West Virginia town, cold December morning, and hundreds of miners, many of them immigrants from Italy, Hungary, Poland, and other parts of Europe, heading down into the Fairmont Coal Company's mines number 6 and No. 8. These guys were the backbone of the industrial boom, digging out coal to fuel America's rapid growth. But on December 6th, everything turned into chaos. At about 10:30 in the morning, a massive explosion ripped through the underground tunnels, sending shockwaves that shook the ground above like an earthquake. Houses rattled, windows shattered, and people in the town rushed out thinking the world itself might be splitting in two. The blast was caused by a lethal mix of coal dust and methane gas, which in a poorly ventilated mine is basically like stacking dynamite and waiting for someone to strike a match. The explosion ripped through the mine shafts, collapsing tunnels, blowing machinery apart, and releasing a wave of deadly carbon monoxide that suffocated nearly everyone inside. Official reports put the death toll at 362, but locals whispered it was way higher, maybe closer to 500 or more, since many unregistered immigrant workers and even teenage boys were inside that day. The sheer scale of loss was staggering. Entire families were torn apart because fathers, sons, and brothers often worked side by side underground. And when disaster struck, it wiped out multiple generations in one horrific instant. Rescue attempts were brave but grim. Teams went down into the choking blackness, hoping to pull survivors out, but most of what they found were lifeless bodies. The gas was so thick and poisonous that even the rescuers themselves sometimes collapsed before making it back out. Above ground, the town of Monongah turned into a scene of heartbreak, with wives, mothers, and children crowding around the mine entrances waiting for news that never came. Church bells rang. Funeral processions stretched on, and cemeteries filled faster than anyone could have imagined. Some widows were left with 6 or 7 children to raise on their own, and immigrant families who had already sacrificed everything to come to America now found themselves broken and destitute. There were stories of women fainting when they saw the wagons carrying out bodies, of children crying at the mine gates, and of local officials struggling to even count the dead properly because so many workers had never been formally registered. The whole town was drenched in grief, and yet the mine owners at the time offered little more than token compensation. a few dollars to families, hardly enough to buy food for a week, let alone rebuild a shattered life. The scale of indifference was almost as shocking as the explosion itself, a cruel reminder of how little power laborers had in that era. But the Monongah disaster was not just another tragic entry in the long list of industrial accidents. It became a turning point that forced America to take a harder look at mine safety. Public outrage eventually led to the creation of the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910, which was tasked with investigating explosions, improving ventilation, and making sure safety measures were enforced. Of course, change was slow and mining remained dangerous for decades, but Monongah stood as a grim symbol of what happens when profit is placed above human lives. Today, the disaster is remembered with memorials in both West Virginia and in Italy, since so many of the victims were Italian immigrants whose names and stories live on through descendants. Walking through Monongah today, you will not hear the roar of the mines, but you will see monuments that quietly tell of the day the town lost nearly everything in a single blast. It is a story of loss, resilience, and the harsh price paid in the pursuit of coal, but it also serves as a reminder of how human suffering can sometimes push the world toward change. The Monongah mining disaster might be more than a century old, yet its echoes still rumble in history, reminding us that behind every lump of coal once stood a man who risked his life to dig it from the earth. On the morning of April 16, 1947, the people of Texas City, Texas, woke up to what seemed like an ordinary day. At the busy port, a French cargo ship called the SS Grand Camp was docked with a load that didn't sound particularly threatening, about 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Fertilizer is usually associated with farming and growth, but in certain conditions, it can become highly unstable and explosive. That morning, a fire broke out in the ship's hold, and smoke started curling into the sky. Workers tried to fight the blaze, even sealing the hatches and pumping in steam in hopes of smothering it, but the attempt only made things worse. The fire heated the chemicals inside, and just before 9 a.m., the ship erupted in a massive explosion that instantly turned the harbor into a scene of destruction. The force of the blast was staggering. It tore through the port, shattering buildings, igniting refineries, and sending shockwaves for miles. People in Houston, nearly 40 miles away, reported windows rattling from the impact. A column of fire and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air, and fragments of the ship were hurled across the city. One piece of the anchor landed more than a mile inland. The explosion was so powerful that it generated a tidal wave, tossing ships onto the shore and creating chaos both on land and water. Fires spread rapidly, and secondary explosions from nearby oil storage tanks only deepened the catastrophe. Within moments, Texas City went from a thriving port community to a disaster zone. The human cost was devastating. At least 581 people were officially killed, though the real toll was likely higher, as some victims were never identified. Over 5,000 people were injured, hospitals were overwhelmed, and more than 500 homes were destroyed, leaving thousands homeless. Rescue workers and volunteers poured in from surrounding areas, but the scale of the destruction was overwhelming, and grim scenes of search and recovery unfolded in the days that followed. Beyond the physical damage, the disaster left scars on the community that took years to heal. The Texas City disaster became a turning point in how the United States handled hazardous materials. It exposed the dangers of storing and transporting volatile chemicals without proper safeguards, and it led to significant changes in safety regulations. It also sparked one of the first major class action lawsuits against the federal government, as survivors and families of victims sought accountability under the newly passed Federal Tort Claims Act. The tragedy served as a painful reminder of how quickly ordinary materials could become deadly under the wrong circumstances. Today, the Texas City disaster of 1947 is remembered not only as the deadliest industrial accident in U.S. history, but also as a lesson in vigilance, safety, and the need to respect the sheer power of the chemicals that fuel modern industry. On April 26, 1942, the Benxihu colliery in Liaoning Province, China, became the stage for the deadliest coal mining disaster in recorded history, and the tragedy was as grim as it was preventable, making it one of those moments where history feels less like a story and more like a warning carved in stone. The mine, controlled by Japanese forces during their occupation of Manchuria, was already notorious for its brutal working conditions, where Chinese laborers were forced into back-breaking shifts under the constant gaze of overseers who valued coal production more than human life. On that spring day, a lethal cocktail of gas and coal dust ignited deep underground, producing a devastating explosion that tore through the tunnels like a firestorm, collapsing supports, filling passageways with flames, and instantly cutting off escape routes. For the miners who survived the initial blast, the nightmare had only just begun, because the fire raged uncontrollably, consuming oxygen and spewing toxic carbon monoxide, turning every breath into a fight for survival. In a decision that still shocks historians, the Japanese authorities chose to seal the mine entrances in an effort to smother the blaze, a move that protected equipment and infrastructure, but effectively trapped more than 1,000 men underground with no chance of rescue. Survivors later recalled the horrific reality as some workers suffocated within minutes while others clung to life in pitch darkness as poison gas silently overtook them. When the mine was finally reopened, the true scale of the disaster emerged with 1,549 miners having lost their lives, a death toll so massive that it still stands as the worst coal mining disaster ever recorded. Yet, beyond the staggering numbers lies a story drenched in wartime cruelty, because many of the dead were not simply workers, but conscripted laborers with little choice in their fate, people whose lives were treated as expendable in the machinery of war and industry. Contemporary reports from Japanese officials at the time downplayed the tragedy, focusing on production losses rather than human suffering, while local families grieved in silence, their voices muted by the political realities of occupation. Over the years, the Benxihu disaster has come to symbolize not just the dangers of coal mining, but also the devastating consequences of prioritizing profit and control over safety and dignity. Mining, by its very nature, is dangerous work, but history has shown that disasters on this scale almost always come from negligence, lack of preparation, and callous disregard for human lives, and Benxihu is perhaps the clearest and most haunting example of all. Imagine for a moment how different the story could have been if the miners had been given even the most basic protections, proper ventilation, or the chance to escape rather than being sealed in like expendable parts of a machine. Instead, the disaster became both a human tragedy and a moral indictment, a reminder that the price of neglect is often measured in lives rather than dollars. Today, when historians or safety experts look back at Benxihu, it is not just the number 1,549 that shocks them, but the circumstances that allowed it to happen in the first place, such as forced labor, inadequate safety measures, and a mindset that valued coal over people. The miners who perished in Benxihu never got the recognition they deserved during their lifetimes, but their story has endured as a stark lesson, reminding the world that progress and power built on human suffering is a fragile foundation destined to collapse.